Good morning.
Good morning.
This morning, you remember we finished last week the irrefutable prophecies concerning the coming of Messiah. And so today we take a one-lesson journey into Obadiah. When you read all of that book, you realize why it's just one lesson. Because it's just what? Sharon told me it was 2 pages long. I was thinking it was more like 1 page long. Or it must have started in the middle of the page. Anyway, it's just a few verses. But the topic today is seeking justice in an unjust world. And tomorrow is the Sanctity of Human Life Day in the United States is set aside. And so our lesson writers have taken the liberty for us to study the book of Obadiah, which deals with justice in an unjust world. So we're looking today at Obadiah chapter, Obadiah verses 1 through 4 and 10 through 17. And the challenge is to join God in pursuing justice in the face of indifference and oppression. No one would deny that injustice occurs in our society and that people experience oppression, even violence. But how should we respond to the tragic and unjust events in the lives of the unborn, the aged, the disabled, and those of different racial or ethnic backgrounds? This is a question that many Christians have yet to answer. God sees the plight of the oppressed and acts on their behalf, and he calls us to do the same. And I see that I did not get all of that on there. So the setting for this passage, for this study, the prophet Obadiah is the author. But we have absolutely no biographical information provided about him in the book, or other than in the book, except that he was a prophet. Obadiah's message is directed toward the Edomites, the descendants of Esau. Do you remember who Esau was? And to all the nations. During the invasion of the Babylonians into the land of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar was leading the attack on Judah and especially Jerusalem, Edom used God's act of judgment to get revenge on God's people. In response, God rebuked Edom. And so this morning we're going to look at this Obadiah. But I thought, this is a unique opportunity for us to also learn somewhat about Edom. Edom actually was the offspring of Esau, who you remember was the brother of Jacob. And you remember whenever they were born, Esau was born first, Jacob came out, they were twins. Jacob came out grasping Esau's heel, as the scripture says, which upon reflection, says, the writer says, this just shows the difficulty between these two. You remember, Esau was a hunter, an outdoorsman. Jacob was a sit around the house, maybe learned to cook, because at least we learned to see him cooking, and was probably his mother's favorite. Esau probably was his dad's favorite. And one day as Esau comes in from hunting, he asks Jacob, you remember, for a serving of the food that he had prepared. And he gave it to him, but with questions, with a request, not request, but with demands, that he would sell his birthright to Jacob for the pot of a stew. And Esau, in my mind, foolishly agreed. He must have really been hungry. Or he just really liked Jacob's stew. I don't know. And then later on, whenever it came time for his father, who was about to pass away, to declare blessings on the brothers, his mother said, "You better get in there before Esau does, or else you will not get the first blessing." And as you know, first sons had special places in the inheritance from the father, which would mean that Esau had that first place. So Jacob put on some kind of a hairy, furry skin on his skin and went in to his father. His father didn't recognize his voice as Esau, had some questions, but then on feeling of his hands, he decided, okay, it must be Esau, because he was blind, essentially, couldn't see. And so he blessed Jacob as the first son. And then when Esau comes in, the father realizes his mistake and says, "I'm sorry, I've already given my blessing to Jacob as first son." And Esau says, "That's not fair," you know, that kind of refrain. And his father does bless him, but it blesses him as the second tier son. So between these two, there had been competition, mistrust, and dissension between them. Esau leaves, as God had said, "I'm going to bless my people through Jacob." And so Esau leaves and goes out to a different part of the area. Finally, whenever his father did die, he did come and participate in the burial circumstances. But the offspring then of Esau is called Edom. Later on, a long time later on, the Edomites were pressed south from where they were and over into the land of Judah. And there, for a while, if there was any intermarriage between a person of Edom and a Jewish person, they were banned for 4 generations from having any of the rights of the Jewish people. But that finally was lifted, and evidently the Edomites had been melded into the Jewish family. But this was long after Obadiah's prophecy. So the instance that causes Obadiah to write this is that when Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians came and attacked Judah, and especially Jerusalem, and it was a long siege. I believe it was about 3 years long, 3-year siege. The people of Jerusalem were going hungry. They had some water to drink because Hezekiah had put in this subterranean tunnel that brought water from one of the outside springs into the city. But they were very hungry. And of course, the battle was ongoing all of the time from Nebuchadnezzar's army. But when Nebuchadnezzar finally breached the walls and came in and started destroying Jerusalem, the Edomites cheered and actually came, and when the city was plundered, the Edomites came in and helped plunder the city, taking whatever goods that they had. And also, whenever some of the Jerusalemites were fleeing and going out, the Edomites were out along the roads and were finding them, taking them, and turning them in to Nebuchadnezzar's friends. And so they had done all kinds of despicable things. You remember whenever the children of Israel came out of Egypt, as they came to the border of Edom, they asked permission to pass through the land of Edom. And Moses said, "We will not drink any of your water. We will not permit our herds to graze. We will take nothing that's in your land. We simply want to use the road that passes through Edom. It's the shortest way for us to go on to the Jordan Valley." Edom, the king of Edom, said, no way. Formed up his army. They never attacked the Israelites, but they formed up the army in case they would need to. And so the children of Israel did not go into Edom. They went around Edom to go on to their destination. This always rankled the people of Israel. So all of this was a lot of background here, but it was always negative between the two. Always. The Edomites were against the Jews, and the Jews were against the Edomites. And so, particularly because of the way the Edomites had oppressed and betrayed and turned in and even killed the Jews during this assault by Nebuchadnezzar, Obadiah writes his one chapter prophecy. So let's look at it in verses 1 through 4. And let's read these first 4 verses. This is what the Lord God has said about Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord. An envoy has been sent among the nations. Rise up and let's go to war against her. Lord, look, I will make you insignificant among the nations. You will be deeply despised. Your arrogant heart has deceived you, you who live in clefts of the rock in your home on the heights, who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you seem to soar like an eagle and make your nest among the stars, even from there I will bring you down. This is the Lord's declaration. Well, I'm seeing this, I copied a different translation into this. So I apologize for that. So this was the vision of Obadiah. And it says, this is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. It is a clear beginning of this prophecy. It is a rumor, if you will. The Lord has sent an envoy or a messenger to the nations to say, rise up against her for battle. I will make you small among the nations, and you will be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. The Edomites lived in what is today the southern, kind of south-central part of Jordan, and a part of of what is now Israel. At the very south part of the Salt Sea, or the Dead Sea. And particularly over on the Jordan side, it is a very mountainous and hilly section. In fact, it also encompasses what is known as Petra. And Petra, Sharon and I visited Petra a number of years ago when we were in Jordan. And it is an amazing thing. It's actually a city that was built in the clefts of the rocks. And it was a very narrow passage to get into Petra. It was almost impregnable. And so you see here that mentioned. He says, even though, in verse 3, your arrogant heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock in your home on the heights, and say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? This nation of Edom had a great deal of arrogance whenever it came to the Jewish people. And they would think that they were, where they lived was impossible to be attacked. And so they were a very arrogant people, and whatever they did toward the Jewish people was always the wrong thing to do. So that is the opening word that he brings to them. And let's look now at Obadiah. So let's ask these questions. What did we learn about the man Obadiah, either directly or indirectly, in these verses? Simply that he was a prophet. The word Obadiah was a common name throughout the Bible, and there are several Obadiahs across history in the Old Testament. And so none of them can be for sure identified with this particular Obadiah. So we really don't know anything about him. Don't know if he was a priest. Don't know if he was a farmer. Don't know if he was a sheep herder. We just don't know. And it is not really betrayed in what he declares in this short book. Who is the subject of Obadiah's prophecy? Well, primarily Edom, but also it includes all the other nations of the earth who are not worshiping Jehovah God. What is the Lord's complaint about Edom? What will come upon them as a result? Well, first he accuses them of arrogance. Now, in this next passage, we'll see a different charge brought against them. But what will come upon them? They will be seen as a small country. They will be despised by the other countries. And what they have done in arrogance and the way they have treated their neighbors will be visited upon them. So some lessons from them. God has always worked through the course of human history to judge evil, to discipline individuals and nations, and to restore his people. God will act in judgment on the presumptuous and arrogant who think they are invincible and beyond the reach of even God himself. People think there's not going to be any retribution for the evil, for the sins that they commit. But this passage and the other passages that we're going to look at is going to show again that God is invincible. He will, and there is nothing that he cannot bring upon people to pay for their sins. Pride and disrespect for the lives of others will lead to judgment from God, who is the source of life. So here, pride and disrespect, that hits home to us today. Pride and disrespect for the lives of others will lead to judgment from God, who is the source of all life. So now let's look at Obadiah 10 through 14. And let's read this. I'm not going to read out the book. I'm going to read off the screen here. We're still up there, right? So let's read it. Verse 10. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day he stood aloof, while strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. You should not gloat over your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble. Hey, he didn't leave anything out, did he? He covers it all. And particularly, he says, on the day you stood aloof, verse 11, while strangers carried off their wealth, you didn't just watch. You didn't just stand idly by. You moved in and you joined them. You entered the gates of Jerusalem and you cast lots for Jerusalem. Okay, let's see. Who gets this one? Okay, who gets that? And you cast lots. You were just like the conquerors, Nebuchadnezzar's army, just like them in bringing problems on the people of Jerusalem. You were gloating over your brother, part of the arrogance. You rejoiced over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. You know, opposition from people you don't know is not easy to take. But opposition from family members, and particularly from brothers or sisters, is very hard to endure, isn't it? And that's what he's saying. He said, this was your brother Jacob, Esau. And this was your family. You were offspring from the same man and woman. And this is the way that you have treated your own family, your own brother, your own relatives. And so then in verses 13 and 14, you shouldn't march through their gates in the day of their destruction. You shouldn't gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster. You shouldn't seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. There he's saying, you know, when a guy's down, you're not to be kicking him. You're to help him up. You're not to take advantage. Just because somebody has run into problems, you're not to take advantage of them. You're not to claim his own possessions or be happy about what is happening to them. Now, if we apply that to our day today, there is an awful lot of this. Maybe sometimes we're even guilty of it ourselves. That we should not be expressing happiness or joy when we see our political opposition suffering, literally suffering. There are whatever, and we shouldn't try to take advantage of them in the midst of their destruction. I'm not quite sure I know how to deal with all of that. Sometimes as I look at the news and I see some of the difficulties that some of my what I'd call my political opposition are enduring, it almost makes me happy. And I feel judged by this passage. It's not that I want them to succeed, but I should not be gloating over their personal problems. And this is what this is dealing with, their personal problems. Their personal problems, gloating over them in their calamity.
But they brought that calamity on themselves.
Perhaps so.
Does it make a difference that these Edomites were related to the Jewish people, whereas we're not related to our opposition?
You're
smart.
That's true too.
Yeah, but they're souls.
Yes,
That, I'm like you. And I just say, Lord, I have a hard time doing this, but.
Yeah, that's right.
it's true.
So, for sure, we need to think carefully about our attitude whenever we stand in opposition to others, or others stand in opposition to us. To be sure that we are acting justly, rightly. It doesn't mean that we want our opposition to succeed. But at the same time, we need to be careful that we are not taking advantage of them personally. I'm still trying to weigh how that works. But the words are clear. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of disaster, nor gloat over them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. I think perhaps this is saying we should not be taking advantage of individuals and their personal surroundings, who they are, what they have, or their physical presence. In our United States political system, we obviously have oppositions. Every party has some opposition to the other parties. This is not talking, I don't think this is talking so much, and test me on this, about opposition, having opposition to others. But for instance, if we projected violence on them, that would be wrong. If we projected taking their physical properties, that evidently would not be right. That would be wrong. And perhaps, so it deals here with marching through their gates in their day of disaster, gloating over them. I think sometimes opposition is gloating over one another whenever the opposition falls into difficulty. It's not that we want them to succeed, I say again, but gloating over them is a word, I think, that majors on arrogance. We don't want to be arrogant about it because we realize we can be just as wrong as they can be. I don't know. What do you think about that? How would you apply this in our current situation? Yes, sir.
I have a less volatile thought. When our son's team plays another team in college and they win or they lose, I have to remind myself that all of the players, somebody's son in any sport we watch. And so that's a small metaphor compared to this large one, but I think we have to understand that, how do I say it? We are blessed because we were strong enough to receive the blessings of God and the trials to get there where they may not be ready. So we should look at them as they weren't strong enough yet,
Okay.
but they're still children of God.
Okay.
I don't know.
Well, Bill, this is and it just happened this week, this kind of thing that just come up. And like I said a while ago, I said, I don't agree at all with what's going on.
Right.
And I said, God has to pay for their salvation. Yeah, we don't agree, maybe our government comes down where they don't.
Yeah.
So,
And there's no question that there's a vast disagreement, amount of disagreement between our political parties, maybe several political parties. But But we still need to respect one another. I'd say we still need to listen to one another and engage and be involved in discourse and communication with one another.
And it's also bad if you can't agree to disagree, that's not a good thing.
That's why we have different denominations of churches.
Yes?
We agree on one thing,
Yeah,
that's Christ is our Savior, but we don't agree on a lot of other things
yeah, that's right.
pertaining to church things and so on.
Yeah.
And the Lord will shake it all out sooner or later.
Also, another charge that he brings, and it's more or less shows there what he says, shame on you because of the violence, and you will be covered with shame. When he says, don't wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives. These were the Jewish people that were fleeing from Jerusalem to try to get out of the chaos and the destruction that Nebuchadnezzar was bringing, and trying to flee and get away. Don't stand at the crossroads where they're going to have to pass and cut them down or hand them over to the marauding army. He said, your family, your brothers, and you should not be treating your relatives like this. Okay, let's look at some questions. What is another complaint the Lord brings against Edom here? It was not only that they were arrogant, but their arrogance was working out into violence and improper, unjust actions. They were taking their part of what they had in Jerusalem. They were marauding, just like the others were, the conquering army was doing. They were not only disagreeing with the Jews, but they were taking pride in the fact, they were rejoicing in the fact that they were experiencing great loss. They not only watched the marauders, the armies come in and start taking their booty, if you will, from the people, they went in and they took it also. And so this was a complaint. You not only were arrogant about Jerusalem, but you participated in the destruction, literally, the destruction even of the individuals by turning them in, the destruction of the people of Jerusalem. To what event does the day refer? Well, it refers to the day whenever Nebuchadnezzar breached the walls and took Jerusalem. So some lessons. The Lord will not tolerate violent, destructive behavior against his people or against any people groups who are suffering abuse by others. Let me read that again. The Lord will not tolerate violent, destructive behavior. That's a good way of describing what they were doing. They were not only opposed to the Jewish people, they were letting it play out in violent, destructive behavior against his people or against any people groups who are suffering abuse for others, by others. The Lord will judge indifference to the plight of others just as he will judge aggressive or violent actions toward others. It says in this verse, in these verses, you stood by and watched and cheered. It was just as a bystander. You didn't lift a hand to help. You didn't try to help. You turned in those that were fleeing from the destruction. Okay, those are the two lessons from that passage of Scripture. Any thoughts there?
You know, really, we're not that much difference today when you have something like that happen, you sit there for one, and find out what they got dessert. So,
Yeah, yeah.
easily speaking, that's, that we find all the time.
So let's look at the last two verses, verses 15 through 17. Let's read these aloud together. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and drink and be as if never been. But on Mount Zion will be deliverance. It will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. So he said there is a day of judgment that is coming, a day of retribution, not just on you, Edom, but for all nations. That even includes the nation of the Jews. As you have done, it will be done to you. I think that's an important word for us. That we need to act and live justly. When we see injustice, unfair treatments of people, we need to not just stand by. We need to speak up, take actions if we can, help the poor, help the disadvantaged, reach out to be loving, kind, and helpful. Your deeds will return upon your own head. And then here this passage I had trouble with. Just as you drank on my holy hill, so all the nations will drink continually. This is a reference to what he says, what you've done, it will be done to you. On the judgment that is coming, you will drink from that cup, the judgment that is coming upon you. And you will not only drink, you will drink continually. You will continue to drink the punishment and the retribution brought by God for your improper actions, your injustice. You will drink and be as if they had never been. In other words, you're going to be gone. You're going to drink to your own destruction the retribution that comes from God because of what you have done. But on Mount Zion there will be deliverance. So he's showing in juxtaposition here, you're going to be judged for what you've done. It's going to come down on you, and you're going to drink from that cup of retribution, of punishment, and drink until you are no more. But the people of Jerusalem, of Zion, will be delivered. They will be holy, and Jacob will possess his inheritance. And so the word here then is that our God is a just God, and we live in an unjust world. And he calls upon us, just as he was calling upon these people, you need to be acting justly, properly, righteously, and correctly. And in our society, especially in these days of confrontation, sometimes I think acting justly is forgotten. It means that we draw up on sides to fight, and we can arrogantly gloat over the distresses that others are experiencing. And God has said we need to be just and act justly to those that are around us. In our society we have people who are homeless, people who are mentally ill and need treatments, people who are disadvantaged, all kinds of people like this. And sometimes we can gloat, and we can even be indifferent to them. And to me, this is a call for us to heighten our sensitivities, to be acting justly in this regard. Let's look at some lessons here, some questions. What does the day of the Lord hold for the just and the unfaithful? it will be a day of retribution. God will bring punishment for our sins. Fortunately for us, we have accepted Christ the Lord, our Messiah, and He has borne our retribution and our punishment. And so because of that, He asks us to also be just as He was just. You remember how He stood up for the woman who was brought before and was to the point of being stoned? And Jesus said to her after they finally left, "Where are your accusers?" Well, they've all left. And He says, "And I don't accuse you. Go your way and don't do this again." He stood up for her. What could the Edomites expect to happen because of their negligence and spiteful behavior? Judgment was coming upon them. To whom is the message of hope directed? To those who were oppressed. In this instance, to the Jewish people. To those who were oppressed. And how is hope possible? Because we know that our God is a just and righteous God and will bring judgment upon those who are despicable, unfaithful, unjust. Wherein is hope to be found? In Jesus. So some lessons. An awareness that the day of the Lord is near ought to motivate all people to prepare themselves for it. The day of the Lord will be a day of judgment for those who refuse the way of the Lord, but a day of eternal deliverance for those who have been faithful to Him. The promises of God cannot be thwarted, no matter how intense the evil opponent. The faithful are to stand for what is right out of a conviction that in the end, God and righteousness will prevail. And so some application. I want to read here a passage that was in one of the books that we get to prepare. In churches across the nation on the day of this study, the focus will be on the sanctity of human life. We will talk about abortion, euthanasia, domestic violence, child abuse, religious persecution, disregard for the elderly, and more. Those are all in our society. And the day following, tomorrow, is Martin Luther King Day, a day that reminds us of the injustices, past and present, against peoples of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. That is part of our national history. On both days, dealing with both issues, we will share our opinions, complain about the lack of government or police action, decry poorly written laws, and rail against questionable legislation and court decisions. Beyond that, what will we do? What should we do? The Lord sees the plight of the oppressed. Whatever the form of oppression, He is displeased. While we may think He is unaware and slow to act, or think He won't act, God is a God of justice. The day will come when He will pour out His judgment on the oppressors. He also has expectations for His people. That's us. He expects us to act on behalf of the oppressed, to stand for right and against wrong. He wants us to offer help to others who are in need and cannot help or speak for themselves. Indifference toward others also will be judged by the Lord. So which words describe your attitude toward those who are victims of tragic and unjust behavior? Which of these words? Unconcern, indifference, regret, compassion, sympathy, or perhaps some other. So, what actions, the second one, what actions are you, your family, and your church taking that position you on the side of justice, especially God's kind of justice, and offer encouragement, help, and hope to innocent victims. So let me ask you, what actions are you, or your family, or this church taking that position us on the side of justice, especially God's kind of justice, and offer encouragement and hope to innocent victims? So let me just read again this list of things: abortion, euthanasia, domestic violence, child abuse, religious persecution, disregard for the elderly, and more, as well as against people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Has our church taken a stand on any of these items?
Yes.
You want to name some of them?
Abortion,
Abortion.
child abuse.
Our pastor is very public about that. Okay? Are any of these in our locale? No. Abortion, euthanasia, domestic violence, yes, we read about that every day in the paper. Child abuse, yes, we read about that every day in the paper. Religious persecution, did you read about or hear about what happened in just south of Fort Worth yesterday? I don't know if those kidnapped victims have been released or not.
Yes.
I think one of
He
them
got
had
shot.
been. I'm sorry?
He was killed.
Or was he? Okay. Disregard for the elderly. We may be more familiar with that one than others, I don't know. Others that you might name?
Human trafficking.
Human trafficking, yes, that's definitely right.
Our church on the M28 ministry is a great ministry for people, the clothing, the
That's
food
right.
they give away.
People down and out, homeless, that's right. That's right. Okay. Yes, our church has definitely taken a stand on several of these. I don't know if any of you are involved in any of the different organizations around that deal with some of these things. I know our church in the past had a lot to do with one of the unwed mothers and violence. There's a house just across the Gore Boulevard over here that deals with domestic violence. I know we've had in times past, don't know about now, if we are still supporting that ministry. But we personally also need to give attention to these injustices in our society.
You know, the thing that really bothers me about, just like that 14-year-old that took those people hostage. You know, here he is, nothing but a child. You know, and he was his mother's baby, you know. It just really, and like homeless people, you know, I see them out, or the other day I saw a guy at the grocery store and he was trying to pay for his gas and he was short a couple dollars, and thank God I had the money, you know, and so I helped him with his gas. But people that are down and out, whether they cause it or not, you know, what happened? You know, like the homeless people. The homeless people really bother me.
A lot of the
Especially when
homeless
it's
people
cold.
have drug problems now.
I know.
Maybe not
I
in the old
know.
days, but so many of them now
I
have
know.
severe drug issues.
It's still, at one point in time, you know, it bothers me.
Yeah. And I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I feel like the issue is so great. I don't know what I